The honourable member for Cariboo, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always interesting to hear the arguments from the other side during this debate. So I'd like to remind, it's a packed house for a late day, late Friday afternoon. I want to thank everyone that's in the gallery. For TV Land can't see, but the gallery's packed today, and I want to thank those that are tuning in TV Land for watching this as well too. I want to remind everybody that is watching in and those that are in the gallery that are listening, this house is your house. The 338 members of Parliament that are elected to be your voice, elected to hold this government accountable. And what we have seen over the course of this debate and why we are here is because of theft of about $400 million, taxpayer funds, money that you have given to the government. That is why we are here, where the Auditor General found 186 conflicts of interest with respect to that theft of over $400 million for this slush fund. The other reason why we're here is that, Mr. Speaker, you yourself, you ordered that the papers be printed and ordered and given to this House so that an investigation can take place. And what was seen? Thousands upon thousands of papers of redacted information. As a matter of fact, the Liberals at the time said, why don't we just let committee study this? And I offered this at the time. I said, well, Mr. Speaker, if somebody steals from you, do you go to a committee or do you go to the RCMP? Because essentially that's what we're talking about, theft. You know, it's interesting. The government is more interested in funneling money to their Liberal insiders and their friends. It's great to be a Liberal insider, a friend or a family member or related to somebody on the front bench or within this House on the Liberal side, because guess what? You get the contract. Guess what? You get the job. You get the appointment. And Mr. Speaker, it's the same thing that we've seen over the last 9 years of this government. Now, our colleagues from the NDP will stand up and carry the water for the Liberals, of course, because guess what? It's their scandal too. They've been holding this government, propping this government up for the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker. So when they stand up and they wax on and on and on, well, it's Conservatives this and Stephen Harper this, guess what? They're just as guilty as our Liberal colleagues across the floor. They're complicit in the scandals and the corruption, Mr. Speaker. It is shocking that, as was noted earlier on by my honourable colleague, who just kind of, it was a backhanded slap for all of us here, that the 2019 election was his first election to vote in, as a matter of fact, and he got elected himself. I think he was the youngest member of Parliament ever voted in, actually. Close, I guess. Listen, you know, Canadians are struggling to get by, while these Liberals are only focused on enriching the lives of their friends and their families. They would say that Canadians have never had it so good. And I'll ask all of those in the gallery or those in TV Land to take a look at your communities. Take a look just outside of this building, just down the street. Does it look the same as it did 9 years ago? Does your community look the same as it did just 9 years ago? No. It's these failed policies, this government's failed policies, that has turned our streets into war zones, that have allowed billions of dollars to be spent on failed policies. Over 47,000 Canadians have lost their lives to overdose, yet this government continues to hand out taxpayer-funded drugs. Where British Columbia, my home province, the leading cause of death for children aged 10 to 18 years of age is overdose, surpasses suicides, natural cause death, and death by accidents. That's staggering. And we heard just earlier today that now reports out of Quebec, it's the same thing. They're seeing that children as young as 11 are becoming addicted to government-funded drugs given out at safe supply clinics. It's shocking. But that's the legacy of this Prime Minister and his government and our NDP colleagues. That's what they've supported. Now, it didn't start today with the Green Slush Fund fiasco. This has been a 9-year pattern of incompetence in avoiding accountability and transparency. And unfortunately, the NDP and Bloc are still supporting this Prime Minister even after all his blunders, after he has failed Canadians for 9 years. As a matter of fact, this government has the most ethics violations in all of our country's history. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Aga Khan scandal, the We Charity scandal, where Conservatives in the opposition caught this government funneling over $1 billion to a charity. $1 billion to a charity. How many beds for recovery for those Canadians that are struggling with addiction would that $1 billion have funded? SNC-Lavalin, where my friend Jody Wilson-Raybould, our first Indigenous female Attorney General, spoke truth to power, did not allow pressure from the Prime Minister and his officers, did not allow that pressure, undue pressure, for her to interfere in a court case that was to protect the Prime Minister's friends. Now, blackface. How many times the Prime Minister has worn blackface so many times he's lost count. Clam scam, where the former Minister of Fisheries took a fishing quota away from a community, Grand Bank, Newfoundland. I just received a message from Great Mayor Rex from there asking how I was. Grand Bank developed this fishery, a surf clam fishery, but the former Minister of Fisheries decided, well, you know what, he's going to take that quota away from that community, 500 jobs. That community almost lost 500 jobs, and was going to award it to a company, an organization that said had First Nations business partners or interests. No, it didn't. Said that it had a boat. No, it didn't. But what it did have, well, it had a member of that minister's family. It was another member of another sitting member of Parliament, still a sitting member, Liberal member of Parliament's brother was part of it, and a former Liberal minister was also one of the partners in that business. That's what we have to deal with every day. That's your government. That's this Liberal government. Arrive scam, cash for access, Emergencies Act, for the first time in our history of our country that a government instituted the Emergencies Act, turned itself on our own Canadians, our own people. We have a Prime Minister that chose to, during a terrible time, pandemic, instead of unite Canadians, he chose to divide Canadians, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. He actually used the words, why should we tolerate these people? Wow. That's unbelievable. Don't even get me started on reconciliation. Where in 2015, when the Prime Minister, then the member of Papineau, was campaigning and made promises about being the most open and forthwith government in the history of our country, his government, under his governance. And he said that the relationship with our First Nations would be the most important of his government. He actually stood there with his hand on his heart, dabbed a fake tear away. And all we've seen with him is he's pitted First Nation against non-First Nation, First Nation against First Nation. That's what these guys do, Mr. Speaker. They choose to divide. And if you don't get along, with their ideology, if you don't believe the same as they do, well, they don't respect you for it. They'll come out and say, well, you're racist, you're a homophobe, you're far right, you're alt-right. Is it alt-right to want to make life more affordable for Canadians? Is it alt-right to be able to want to bring our loved ones home that are struggling with addictions? We talk about crimes up, times up. Mr. Speaker, I want to bring it back to my riding of Caribou Prince George. My own community is suffering under this radical, incompetent NDP Liberal government. Instead of dealing with crime and corruption they have unleashed on our streets, they would rather line their friends' pockets. Just last week, one of my constituents, a gentleman by the name of Bob Hubbard, returned home in the middle of his day to find a bunch of drug-addicted criminals basically looting his house. And so in his efforts to stop these criminals, the criminals drug Mr. Hubbard down the road, ran over him, left him for dead. Now, Mr. Hubbard is laying in the hospital right now in Vancouver. The extent of Mr. Hubbard's injuries, he's had to have facial reconstruction surgery. His arm was almost, they might have to amputate it, or they were considering having to amputate it. Broken ribs, flailed chest. He's going to have numerous surgeries. Now, the RCMP managed to catch one of these criminals. But guess what? Less than 24 hours later, that criminal was back on the streets. That is this government's record. Criminals should be locked up. Criminals who should be locked up are out on bail due to the Prime Minister's hug-a-thug revolving door justice system. We need jail, not bail, when it comes to violent offenders. After 9 years, violent crime is up 50%, gun violence 116%. That is this government's record. In 2022, 29% of all murders were committed by offenders who were released from jail early. This week, the police associations in Toronto, Vancouver, Surrey, all came out and called this government's BS on their gun policies. The Toronto Police Association said this: criminals did not get your message. Our communities are experiencing a 45% increase in shootings, a 62% increase in gun-related homicides compared to this time last year. What difference does this government's handgun ban make when 85% of all guns seized by their members can be sourced to the United States? The Vancouver Police Union said this: guessing the Prime Minister is not aware of the ongoing gang war here in BC, which is putting both of our members and public at risk on a daily basis. The Surrey Police Union said the federal handgun freeze fails to address the real issue. That is the surge of illegal firearms coming across our borders and ending up in the hands of our violent criminals. This NDP Liberal government is turning our communities into war zones, and they're making them unsafe for Canadians. In other news from my riding, Mr. Speaker, now in the fall of 2021, I spoke of a gentleman that decided in the community of Vanderhoof in my riding, decided he was going to go out and hunt RCMP. Hunt RCMP, Mr. Speaker. And what he did was he terrorized the small community. He shot up the detachment, firing large caliber rounds into the detachment, narrowly missing both enlisted and civilian members of the RCMP. To this day, despite promises from the front bench, Vanderhoof is still sitting and waiting for a new RCMP detachment. This detachment that they have still has the bullet holes in there. Mr. Speaker, that is shameful. Now, news broke last night. This gentleman that shot up and hunted RCMP members. This gentleman that shot up an RCMP detachment and hunted these members. Not only did that, but terrorized the streets of Vanderhoof. Last night we found out that his sentence of 5 years has been cut in half. Sorry, his sentence has been cut in half to only 5 years for shooting a building full of police officers and vulnerable staff. That is staggering. The union, which represents 20,000 RCMP officers across Canada, said the appeal decision sends a horrible message to the public. This is a slap in the face to all of us, said Jeff Swan with the National Police Federation. He continued, this high-powered rounds that take people's lives, and the verdict is insulting. It's unfathomable given the current environment that our police officers face. Canada's justice system is broken under these NDP Liberals, and only Conservatives will bring home jail, not bail, and stop the crime. Mr. Speaker, 2 million Canadians are lining up at food banks each month due to this NDP Liberal government's inflationary policies and carbon tax. 2 million Canadians each month. I ask those people that are listening in again, how many tent encampments do you have in your community? Did you have that 9 years ago? Mr. Speaker, over 1,400 tent encampments in British Columbia, or in Ontario, have crept up. I know in my province of British Columbia, we are seeing tent encampments along the highways and rest areas along the highways. Life has become unaffordable for most Canadians after 9 years. Instead of fixing the problem and what they broke, the Liberals get caught wasting more taxpayer dollars to funnel to their green slush fund. $400 million. That's $400 million that could have went a long way to fixing some of these policies and these challenges that we face in our communities, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned earlier over 47,000 Canadians lost their lives to overdose since 2016. Overdose is the leading cause of death for youth aged 10 to 18 in my province of British Columbia. This crisis has been exacerbated by failed Liberal NDP policies, including experiments called so-called safe supply and the decriminalization of deadly drugs in BC. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago we brought the parents of, we saw the parents of Brianna McDonald. Brianna McDonald was a 13-year-old, had just turned 13 years of age, and she died from an overdose in a homeless encampment in Abbotsford, BC. Masher Krupp testified yesterday, an Ottawa mother whose daughter died from an overdose and whose son is addicted to government-funded hydromorphone. How can this government live with themselves when they spend $1 billion on failed drug policies to perpetuate addiction and make overdose worse, rather than investing in treatment and recovery for our loved ones? The bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, this NDP Liberal government has now frozen the business of this House with their green slush fund scandal. They could end this right now by handing over the documents that Parliament requested so we can allow the RCMP to do their jobs and arrest the Liberal cronies at STDC. Instead, they're trying to cover their tracks and defend the corrupt behavior of their friends. Meanwhile, our country is broken and hurting. Only common sense Conservatives will fix what this Prime Minister has broken. Mr. Speaker, the time is up. It's time for this government and this Prime Minister to face and call a carbon tax election. Let's bring it home.